And better yet, do you have an idea for a project you'd like us to help you with? We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
problems. But as African sociologists and African descendant sociologists got into the field, they began to come up with their own theories. And based off of the particular experiences of modern Black society, whether that's the society that's coming out of colonization, or like you mentioned, the society that's coming out of enslavement. So you have different problems that you have to address. You know, European sociology can address things like just class, but Black sociology has to look at class, race, and then African American and African descendant female sociologists such as Anna Julia Cooper, they bring in gender into it as well. So you got all of these new theories that emerge from Black folks, and they actually try to provide some of those answers and give us some theories that we can use to answer the particular problems that we have as a people. So that's been done, and I think more people need to be exposed to it. The problem is, even now in 2022, if you're a Black student, you go into sociology, you might be hard pressed to even hear about a Black sociologist. You could go through, I've had students tell me that are in the sociology departments, and then they take a class with me in African American studies, and they say, I never heard of Du Bois. And I said, how is that possible? You're in sociology. Well, we don't talk about it. We don't talk about Anna Julia Cooper. We don't talk about E. Franklin Frazier or some of the others, St. Clair Drake and some of these other people. So you still have that. So it's an ongoing process. But that's a really interesting question. And then, in addition to that, many of the European sociological theories are based off of European history and European observations. You know, Karl Marx, Augustus Comte, and all these people. And they make these grand theories that the rest of the world attaches to, like Marxism. But it's based off of observing a European factory system. But then when we have, because we have a lack of historical understanding, even when our Black sociologists sometimes make theories, they base it off of a European history because they don't understand this history. And they can't pull from it to make theories that were better suited for African descendant people. So that's a continued struggle. It's a continued process, but I think a lot of good work is being done in that regard. But that's
So from that standpoint, then we can understand that we're still up against barriers in the sense that there's organized ignorance, and then there's ignorance that they don't want us to know about. For instance, if only now many of us are able to read about, for instance, emancipation. Look at 1834. Who were the first people to be emancipated, so to speak? They were children 6 and under. What does that alone tell us about sociology?
And again, it tells us that everything is subservient to that almighty dollar. And it tells us a lot. And then even then, you get emancipated, but then you have to enter the apprenticeship program. So yeah, there's a lot to these things. And you're right, that struggle continues. And thank you for that. Daniel, I saw your hand. Was it you had something in the chat, or did you have something to add about Ghana?
I just had a quick comment on Mr. Thomas's question about sociology, because Sheikh Anta Diop actually wrote a book called Pre-Colonial Black Africa, which he actually says in the preface was written specifically to be a case study in African sociology. And what he does is he looks at African kingdoms that were Muslim and African kingdoms that weren't, and says, these are the things that we do that are similar, and these are the things we do that are different. So I think that might be a good resource for Black sociology as well. I just wanted to put that out there.
Oh, appreciate that. Thank you. Always coming with the good sources. Anything in the chat? I see there's 2 things in it, but anything? Any questions?
No, there's no questions in the chat right now.
All right. So let's move on then. We'll move on to we're moving further south, and we're talking about the Nok Kingdom. the Nut culture. And this Nut culture, it actually comes from the contemporary name for this region. So now we're moving into modern day Nigeria. So we're going south and east of ancient Ghana. And unlike Ghana, we don't have any written information about the Nut culture. We don't have any. It's no one wrote about the Nut, and all we know comes from archaeological evidence. But we shouldn't despair, because in 2022, we have so many ways to reconstruct this area of African history just using archaeology. So we're going to talk about it. And again, I want to talk about some of the things that were found in the Nut culture. This area is very famous for its terracotta sculptures. And there's a big fight right now to get many of these back into Nigeria. Some of them have been returned, but a lot of this stuff was taken in the early 20th century when Nigeria was under colonization by the British. They ended up in British and American and German museums. And a lot of that stuff is being returned to Africa, and that's a fight for Africa's cultural heritage. But in the early 20th century, I think the 1920s, these were found in Nigeria. And there's some of the largest, most intricate terracotta sculptures in the world. And some of the oldest in this region of Africa. Terracotta just means baked clay. So they form these out of clay, they bake them, and then you have these representations of people, some of them representations of animals. And the archaeology can tell us a lot of things. It can tell us how old these are. It could tell us, kind of the geographical area where they're at, but we don't know exactly what they were for. So we have to do some hypotheses about what they could be. Are they ritualized? Were they for temples? Were they for palaces? Were they used as some type of agricultural religious object that would help with better farming? We don't know, but we have some information. There's other images of what they look like. These are beautifully sculpted things. And these were done, again, between the years 900 BCE and 200 BCE. Others. So what does the archaeology tell us? From these sculptures and from other things. So once these sculptures was found, a number of excavations happened in the region. And we found houses, we found dwellings, cities, and this was a very urbanized culture in what's now central and northern Nigeria, really central Nigeria, around the modern day capital of Abuja. So, and kind of a preview for September. In September, Daniel and I are going to be doing a 4-week seminar on the history of Nigeria. Nigeria is the country in Africa with the largest population. And I looked at Carleton University's course catalog for the spring and the fall. I looked at the University of Ottawa's course catalog. I looked at many universities. There's not one class taught on Nigerian history, and it's the most populous country in Africa. Yet there are 3 or 4 classes about British history. And there's almost 250 million people in Nigeria. In a couple of years, Nigeria is going to be one of the most populous countries in the world. Yet all of African history gets thrown in. If there's even a class on African history, it all gets thrown in to one class. And you might not even learn much about Nigerian history. So Daniel and I are going to be putting on a seminar coming from here, 4 weeks in September, that's going to be dealing with Nigerian history before colonizations. We're not even going to talk about when any Europeans even came to Nigeria and what was going on. Who were the kings? Who were the queens? What was some of the sociology, the ancient sociology? So we're going to talk about that. But this is kind of a preview of a little bit of that. What the archaeology tells us. So carbon-14 dating tells us that the Nut culture goes back to around 1500 BCE. 1500 BCE. So this is around the time of Egypt's Middle Kingdom, when we have these terracotta sculptures and this culture begins. Carbon-14. So I told you all at the beginning that I'm going to put my science hat on for you to explain how this works. Carbon-14 dating is an archaeological technique that helps us determine how old things are. Here's where the science comes in. Every life form on this planet, from plants to animals to human beings, are all carbon-based. We're carbon-based life forms. Carbon is in the atmosphere. It's all around us. We breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide. We eat plants. We eat animals that eat plants. So carbon is all mixed up in us. Carbon's atomic structure, atomic weight, is usually, if you're just talking about a regular carbon atom, is an atomic weight of 12. And if there's any scientists on here, and if I'm getting this wrong, feel free to correct me. And if you're watching the recording, you're like, he's getting this completely wrong, write it in the comments so we can correct it. I don't mind being corrected. But carbon's weight is 12. Carbon has 6 protons. Carbon has 6 neutrons. Boom. It makes it a very stable atom. But sometimes in the atmosphere, in the world, carbon takes on extra neutrons. So if you think back to your 9th grade chemistry class, you got an atom, it has protons in its nucleus that are positively charged. It has neutrons in its nucleus that don't have any charge, and it has electrons. So carbon has 6 protons, 6 electrons, 6 neutrons. Pretty standard. Occasionally, carbon atoms will take on 2 extra neutrons. And that's when it becomes carbon-14. Because now it has, instead of being carbon-12, which is 6, weight of 6, 6 plus 6 is 12. Now it's 6 plus 8, so it's carbon-14. When it becomes carbon-14, it becomes radioactive. Now, carbon-14 is all around us, but it's in very minute levels. Most of the carbon around us is carbon-12. Carbon-14 is very minute, but it's around. Because it's radioactive, it decays. And it decays at a steady rate. So once something dies, that carbon-14 starts to decay. And we can test, and it doesn't completely go away for about 50,000 years. So we know at any given time how much carbon-12 is in the atmosphere and the proportion of carbon-14 in the atmosphere and what that is normally, and then when the carbon-14 starts to decay. So we can date things within that 50,000 year period, and we can go backwards. So when you find something that is related to carbon, that was once alive. So if you find residues of plants, human bones, animal bones, skin, anything that was once alive, within 50,000 years, you can do carbon-14 dating and figure out when this thing last lived. Because the carbon-14 decays at a steady rate. So that's how we use carbon-14 to date things. So carbon-14 dating tells us that the Nook culture goes back to 1500 BCE. They did some excavations, they found some plant life, some plant matter, they did the dating, and they figured this thing out. Archaeology can also break down things like this. This is an image from contemporary Nigeria. These are sisters pounding yam in a ceramic pot. Ceramics are great tools for archaeology. Everything in this, we have the techniques now to date everything about what's going on there. So if someone was to, if this had happened, if this scene had happened thousands of years ago, and something happened and that this got buried or whatever, we can find out so much information about these people and about this community just from that pot. Not even the entire pot, just a segment of it. Let me show you a demonstration. Let me see if I can do this to kind of make this make sense. All right. I have a couple of things. I have a ceramic saucer. Came from, I don't know, I might have bought this set from Canadian Tire or something like that. I got a chicken nugget and a napkin, and I got some sweet and sour sauce. So, if I was eating, I would put my sweet and sour sauce on my nugget, and yum, 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 I'm eating my nugget, I got my plate, and let's say something happens, and this plate gets destroyed. So I'm going to destroy this plate. At least I'm going to try. Let's see what happens. All right. Plate smashed up. and we get these fragments. Let me get a good one. Archaeologists can take a little piece of fragment like this, little tiny piece, and they might find even the rest of it and try to reconstruct the plate. But they can do a couple of things with these fragments. So let's say thousands of years from now, or thousands of years ago, this plate was in use and someone had eaten a chicken nugget or eaten a piece of chicken with some sauce off of this plate. Now what we can do with archaeology and what was done with the people that lived in the Nook culture, they found pottery. First thing we could do is something called thermoluminescent testing. Thermoluminescent testing. Archaeologists can take this, do some tests, and figure out when this ceramic was actually baked. When this ceramic was actually, so that'll give us a year. So let's say this was baked in 700 BCE. All right, that's thermoluminescent testing. You can test when anything that was put to fire, when it was actually created. Another thing you could test. In archaeology, we can test the actual chemical makeup of the clay that was used to create this ceramic. We can say, was it local? Did the people just go a couple of meters down the road, couple of miles down the road, collect the clay, form the saucer, bake it? Or did this clay come from somewhere hundreds of miles away? Did the actual ceramic itself, was it locally produced, or did it come from trade routes thousands of miles away? Now, if someone was looking at this thousands of years from now, they would say, okay, this looks like a number of the pieces of pottery that we found that are connected to Canadian Tire, which was a big store. And a lot of their stuff came from China, which will allow us to know that there were trade routes going from China to Canada, and pottery was one of the main things that were being traded. So you can tell an entire story from just this short, where it came from. So that means it had to get from China to Canada some type of way. In the Nook culture, we know that the clay to create those terracottas came from one central place. This is just the an example of the carbon-14. We can also do carbon-14 on this because something was alive on this. The chicken that I was eating will leave a residue, and that could be analyzed. Even that, the sauce, the sweet and sour sauce, it's carbon-based. It's made up of something that was possibly plant matter that was possibly alive, honey and other things. So you can use carbon-14 data if you have any type of that residue on it. And this is what it looks like. So this is how much the percentage of carbon and the decay, and goes all the way until there's no more, and 50,000 years. So this steady decline, you can chart, oh, we have this much carbon, that means it's from 10,000 years ago. Oh, we have this percentage of carbon-14, oh, it's from 20,000 years, so on and so forth. We know that the terracottas, because of what we found, were crafted closer to the 9th century BC. So even though it was around 1500, they didn't start making these heads until around the 9th century BCE. They tested the clay. They found that the clay was from a central source. Now, this was the Nook culture, going back to this map, and it doesn't really, it's not, it may not show it, but this is a very extensive area. And because we know all of these heads, which were found all over, not just in this area, but all over this area, that means there must have been central political control. If all the clay came from one area, that means artisans are coming to one area to pick up a particular type of clay. We don't know if it was for spiritual reasons or why this particular type of clay was being used, but it was all located in one area. And then they made these statues other places in the kingdom. So we know that there must have been some type of central political control, or at least central economic control, for that to occur. Archaeological chemistry, something called lipid analysis, can show you exactly what type of food was not on the terracotta. They weren't eating off these, but if they found one of these ceramic pots used for food, you can use lipid analysis. And every food leaves behind a particular trace of what it is. So honey has a different lipid analysis than other plants. We found out they were eating okra, they were eating African eggplant, other crops that are still being grown in Nigeria today. So all of this, from little pieces of pottery and things like this is the future of how we're going to reconstruct African history. And we're getting more and more techniques every day. So again, and I always make this appeal to the young people that if you're interested in history, there's so much you can do. You can apply your scientific skills to reconstructing African history. You can apply your communication skills to do things like this so that we can broadcast the history. You can do so much because we need so much, because again, with the lack of written records in this part of time, we need to use all these things to figure out what we created and what we did. But that's key. So think about that, and think about how much it takes. I broke this on purpose. Pottery is really good because, you know, unless you have some industrial size pulverizer, you're not going to get this into dust. So we can always find things like this and always use it to date and to understand what was going on in our people's past during this particular time. The last thing I'll talk about today is iron producing, which started here around 400 BCE. Iron is a game changer. Iron is just like that camel technology we talked about a little bit earlier. Iron is a game changer as well. Iron was developed independently by different peoples around the world at different times. There used to be an old theory, a very racist theory, that iron was produced somewhere very close to Europe, of course, and then diffused throughout to the rest of the world. Because early anthropologists and historians couldn't believe that non-European people could develop iron on their own. But archaeological evidence has showed us that this is what happened. It wasn't one place and then the technology diffused everywhere. Different peoples at different times figured out, if we take this rock, which is iron ore, and we heat it to a certain degree, we can get rid of the impurities, we have pure iron, and we can use that, we can forge it. So there's a difference between smelting, which is just taking iron ore and actually, no, there's a difference between forging and smelting. You can take iron ore, you could break it down and make things out of it, or you could smelt it, which is firing it, removing the impurities, getting pure iron, and then forging it and making things out of it. People learned to do this, and probably came from people experimenting with pottery. When kingdoms and craftsmen that existed in cultures like the Nook culture were burning the clay to make these terracottas, they probably had iron ore around and were seeing what was happening to the iron ore as it was being heated. And they probably experimented and realized we can make stronger tools with this iron than we could with other things such as bronze and even wood and other things that we're using for tools. When this happens, and it first happens in Africa, in Central Africa, and then diffuses to other parts of the continent. Very early, actually, around 1000 BCE in Central Africa, iron is being produced. And the blacksmiths, even though it eventually diffuses, blacksmiths try to keep it a secret, because you can do two things with iron. Well, you can do a lot of things with iron, but back then, the two primary uses of iron were for agricultural production. Now you can grow more crops because you can clear more land, because you can cut down more trees a lot easier with iron knives, iron machetes, that type of thing. And you can plow even tougher ground with iron plows. So you're growing more food, which means the population is getting bigger because more people are eating. In addition, you can use iron to make stronger weapons. So if you're coming up against people that are using wood clubs, or they might have bronze weapons, and you have iron weapons, you have a military advantage. And you can conquer more areas or force more people to bow down in submission to your kingdom as you grow. So iron was a military secret for a lot of these communities. It became a spiritual thing and a military thing. And blacksmiths became incredibly powerful. So they tried to keep it a secret, but eventually it spreads. When this happens, it changes the dynamics of communities. you get more centralization, you get more expansion, you get larger empires, and you get more people because now you're able to grow more food. So iron is a incredible technological jump around this time in Africa and other places in the world. What we're going to study next week, we're going to look at the Bantu migrations, which come out of a little bit further southeast of where this Nook culture existed in Nigeria and diffused throughout Central Africa into Southern Africa and East Africa. So we'll talk about the history of this, how iron was incredibly important to this spreading, what we know about it, and using other sources. Again, archaeology will play a key role in us reconstructing this history, but also oral history comes into play, as well as linguistics, because we can use linguistics to study how people moved and how their societies were organized. So that's what we'll get into next week. We'll stop here today, and we'll open up to any questions or general discussion. So we'll turn the recording off, and yeah, we'll go from there. So thank you all. We'll start again next week. Daniel, go ahead.
Someone in the comments asked, based on your explanation of carbon-14 dating, anything older than 50,000 years may not be accurately dated.
Correct. At least not with carbon-14. There's other things that you can do. You can look at where it is in terms of the level of the ground. So the further deep you go, the older it probably is. But it's not as conclusive as carbon-14 dating. There's other techniques to give us the time period, but you can't use carbon-14. That's the only thing. But there's other techniques to date things. And another thing I want to mention about carbon-14, we've kind of messed up carbon-14 dating for people in the future because of human activity and human pushed climate change, because of all the CO2 and carbon monoxide that we've pumped into the atmosphere. Future generations aren't going to be able to do carbon-14 dating because we've messed up the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere. So it won't be accurate for people that are studying this time period. They're not going to be able to use carbon-14. I mean, but the way human beings are acting, there might not even be people around to study us because of how we're destroying the earth. But that's a whole nother conversation for another time. But yeah, we've messed it up for everybody. They won't be able to use carbon-14 dating in the future. Any other questions or comments or announcements? Robin, go ahead. And Daniel, let me know if there's anything in the chat.
All right. I guess one question and then a couple of reports. So the question would be, so you mentioned the blacksmiths were had tried to keep iron secret. Clearly, they failed. I'm just kind of curious about what happened and how the secret got out, I guess, in a sense. But and then a couple quick reports. So I just came back from the third National Black Canadian Summit in Halifax, which was awesome. Also, like I said, Michaela Jean and her foundation organized it, and Michaela Jean is fantastic, I guess. So, anyway, great event, 1,400 people, 1,400 people there, and really well organized. They did a declaration at the end that has some strong demands of all three levels of government, the whole bit. So it was great. Great event, and they said the next one will probably be at the end of the UN decade, and in 2024. So 2024 in Montreal.
Okay.
They are anticipating. So with that, and the other thing is, you may know today is Jam Day, i.e. Jamaica Day, in Vincent Massey Park. That started at 11 o'clock. So Jamaica Day, so I don't know if you know, Jamaica Day has been going for years. Annual thing in the park, with music, people come and have meals and stuff. And every year, they have the police and have a tent where they go and basically they recruit, right? So including this year, right? So after George Floyd, after the pandemic, after the occupation, somehow they still have a tent down there. So I'm going down with one of our hub volunteers to engage whatever officers are there in a conversation. And we're basically the main topic will be the two main assumptions that bring them there. And one is that police actually provide value, and two, but there's problems, and the two, having more black police officers makes things, will improve things. So we'll be asking questions that basically say, well, if that's the case, that the U.S. has had black officers for a long time. That didn't change things. We got black officers in Ottawa for a long time. We had the occupation where the cops were let it happen. We're taking selfies with white supremacists. So why should we believe that having more black officers is going to change it? And for sure, if I know the OPS, it's going to be a black officer we'll be talking to. So we'll give you the report how that goes next class.
See how it goes. I didn't even know Jam Day was today. So that's interesting. But yeah, I've been to a lot of black events where there's police booths and record. They used to when I was an undergrad, the FBI and CIA used to recruit at my historically black college, and one of my professors who taught African American history, Dr. Poe, he says it's like, and particularly FBI, he's like, that's like the Klan recruiting on a college. If you know the history of COINTELPRO, that's like the Klan, like recruiting on a black college campus. But yeah, so we have these things. So that'll be interesting. Yeah, I love the report. And I'm assuming, did they do a write-up from the conference? Like, is there the declaration, the things that they asked, is that published yet?
I don't know if it's actually on the website yet. It's going to be though.
Okay.
At the conference, they did a actually about 6-bit rendition of like parts of it, not the whole thing. They were using everything, but the actual full declaration is going to be posted on the website. So as soon as I'm aware of that, I'll share that with the hot list. I know you're on that.
And to answer your question about the blacksmith, so a couple of things happen. Sometimes leaders would become tyrannical and people would move and kingdoms would split. So you had people moving to different regions and taking that technology with them. Sometimes you would have those groups, even with that technology, still get conquered. We're going to talk about the transition from the Kingdom of Ghana to the Empire of Mali in part 2 of this class. And the big battle is between the hero of Mali, which is Sundiata, and the blacksmith who was the last like king of Ghana, even though Ghana was small at that time, Sumunguru. And Sumunguru was a blacksmith, and they lose to Mali. And when that happens, that technology gets subsumed under Mali and then spread. So people moved and kingdoms fell and different things happened. So that's how it kind of spread as people moved and as kingdoms fell. Any other questions or comments? Anything in the chat, Daniel?
I don't see anything else in the chat right now.
Okay. All right, then everybody, we'll stop for the day. We'll pick up again next week. We'll talk about the Bantu Migrations. You will hear from a few of the youth that have been working this summer, creating their own African history classes, and we'll go from there. So we'll meet again next week. Thank you, everybody.